Cameron, so I hope you warmed up, because this is the real reason why I brought you this next question, this next thing. In 3 months' time, it is the 40th anniversary of the formation of the UDF, the United Democratic Front. You were involved in this. You were one of the main Owens in the UDF. Please tell me what the UDF means to you, reflecting on that. Just as you're sitting here right now, the legacy of that movement, what made it so special, what was what constituents that it drew from, particularly here in the Western Cape?
Yeah, look, I think I must clarify your reference to me being one of the main Owens, because I just want to just give a little bit of history, because sometimes people think, at a level of age. So I just wanted to just talk a little bit about that, because the UDF had a huge impact on my life and my participation in the struggle. But the generation that actually were there to launch it in 1983 was slightly ahead of me. So, for instance, we became involved in the UDF through the affiliates. We had the non-racial student movement. So historically, white students were part of NUSAS, and then black students part of AZASO, and then also COSAS, the high school student movement. We actually also built a group called PAG, the Pupils Awareness and Action Group, which organized in schools like Westerford, Cape Town High in the 80s. But anyway, these students became affiliated to the UDF. So I recall being part of UDF GCs and area committees from 84, 85. But the actual launch, and I'm putting this on record, you'll find pictures of Joe Marks, Trevor Manuel, Archie Gumede. But literally, I was a second-year student at the time, just being inducted, and I was recruited into the ANC in about 87. But the UDF impacted on so many of our lives, I think in a few ways. You couldn't become an individual member of the UDF. You had to come through an organization. So either like Cape Areas Housing Action Committee, KHAC, Western Cape Civic Association, COSAS, NUSAS, AZASO. You had area committees, trade unions. So it was really a popular front where organizations came together under this banner of the front and sort of developed a minimum program around which people united. So yes, of course, there were ideological debates at times, but the focus was literally uniting the people. UDF Unites, Apartheid Divides. It was building a broad front against apartheid, undermining the illegitimate local authorities there, the management committees, the black local authorities, this whole notion of building almost an alternative or people's power, an alternative to the... But for me, it was mass-based. It was focused on a particular issue. It built non-racialism. I mean, I have vivid memories of a student activist going into KTC, into Mitchell's Plain, million signature campaign that we conducted, going door to door, collecting signatures for the release of political prisoners, and meeting activists from different communities. And I think many of those activists were kind of, in a way, building kind of a non-racial activism across the historic racial lines. And I think for many of us that opened up our eyes. I think whether we were black students or white students, we were having we were being pulled together on the basis of a common belief. I know that although the End Conscription campaign wasn't a direct UDF affiliate, there were many of us from other affiliates who also got involved in the End Conscription campaign. And that, as a single issue campaign at that time, actually had a huge impact on sections of the white community, because young men were dying in Angola. They were going into the townships. They felt, some of them at least, felt uncomfortable. Their mothers, their girlfriends, boyfriends, and it became an issue, even a self-interest issue in the white community. Why do our young men have to go and fight in the first place? And then as consciousness developed, what are we fighting for? And that broadness of approach, was, I think, also inspired by the UDF type of politics. But I think it was issues of accountability, issues of local taking up the issues of the people. So if the trade unions brought an issue about a factory where workers were being mishandled, unfairly treated, that would become an issue that the area committee would take up. So it was focused on people's interests, although under the umbrella of a broader political push that apartheid is evil, unjustifiable, it must be replaced by one person, one vote, freedom of political prisoners, etc. And it established a kind of a mass movement. You would remember that the ANC was banned still. Many of the movements were actually suppressed, the leadership under banning orders. So the UDF was almost an emergence of mass popular organization again, which was truly inspired people to get involved. And yeah, it had an impact, I think, particularly on activists like myself and many others. And I want to say it again, like 84, 85, became much more involved, was not there planning the launch. But as student affiliates, we got very involved. And, dealing with issues of comrades and friends being detained, seeing support committees emerge, going into townships. I remember in the mid-80s, there was the Witduka War in KTC, where the conservative leadership of many of the black local authorities were literally targeting comrades. And, we were literally having to go in, provide support, get people out. If shacks were being burned by the Witduka, it was like almost a mini civil war, which many people got drawn into. So those were experiences for me as a 21, 22-year-old, being exposed to all of that. Did help that my mother, for instance, was a Black Sash member, and
Yes.
she was quite a conscious member of a very conservative community in George, where we grew up. But being exposed to non-racial politics, mass politics, tools of organization, strategy and tactics, building a broad front, seeking consensus, I think those were all very important lessons.
How did the UDF manage internal, I would say, differences?
It's interesting that you ask, because, people often, in discussing UDF politics in the Western Cape context, would say, there were the Israelites and the Trevorites and, sort of different perspectives and around personalities. But generally, I think the way that differences were managed was that there was a campaign, there was a vision, there was an outcome that we were seeking to achieve, to destroy apartheid. So, yes, there were elections for UDF executives, and I remember at one stage many of the UDF leadership were detained in Pollsmoor and many restricted, and some of us had to form a UDF interim committee to run the Defiance campaign in 1989 that I was very involved in, with people like Dalla Omar, Willie Hofmeyer, Bulelani Ngcuka, Mbui Khalawi and others, but also to organize the AGM of the UDF Western Cape. But then, that was 89, then we came to 1990 and the unbanning and so on. But the issue was that those divisions were not that great, because it was the Free Mandela campaign, the March to Pollsmoor, it was things that were going on in Belgravia Road. So people were united around that struggle, and the issue of seeking, who's going to be the secretary of the UDF were not really there. I mean, they were, as I said, referred earlier, the one ideological difference was that in our province, you sort of had the unity movement tradition, who were very critical about what they refer to as the charterists, the Freedom Charter people. There was obviously the PAC, who had left the ANC because of the participation, I think initially mainly of members of the Communist Party, but also, because of the participation of whites within the organization. And, we you had different types of politics. So some of the left movements kept themselves out of the UDF. So the challenge was actually building this broad front. And even at the struggles in sport, there was SACOS, and then the move towards the National Sports Congress. National Sports Congress came and was part of the UDF, etc., in which people who were not Congress people or charterists had a problem with. But so it was those politics. And I remember once one of the Kennedys came to visit from the US, from the Democratic Party, and there was this huge debate about whether, taken from a perspective of the US being an imperialist power, and at that time you would remember that Reagan and others, didn't support sanctions. But I must get the timing exactly. Anyway, there was a debate, but eventually the outcome was won by those who argued that by having a platform or finding a way, to isolate apartheid further, one would not need to have an antagonistic approach towards the visit, and so on. So there were those issues of strategies and tactics, but it wasn't differences around, I like Roscoe more than I like Cameron or whatever, or maybe we differed on perspectives about how to prosecute the struggle and take it forward. So I think those internal issues were almost subsumed in the immediate campaigns of actually liberating our country, freeing political prisoners, unbanning political organizations, starting genuine negotiations for a democratic constitution. And I think for those many early years, that was the focus and
the mission.
And what united people.
What strikes me about the UDF era, it was a true rainbow coalition. They talk about rainbow coalitions now. That's the word of the month. But the UDF drew people from all races, all cultures, all backgrounds around the struggle.
Yeah, I mean the mobilization in the Christian community. There's so many examples of how the church leadership came out and got involved and had congregations coming with them. The Muslim community, there were organizations like Jews for Justice at the time who sort of came out. So it was, as you say, a very broad and a consciously inclusive, as broad as possible. And I think that's where the debate happened. Like, are you including liberals in this? Are you including, how broad is this front? And it was a lesson in front politics. And I think one of the things we've lost is our ability to work broader in society,
yes.
To actually make sure that we engage about the real concerns which the same organizations that we were working with then in the front have today, whether they are civic or ratepayers organizations, issues of the trade unions, concerns that the churches or faith communities have. So I think there are many lessons from that era, but I think we learned a lot from being in that generation. Basic strategy, tactics, organizing, getting on the ground, working in ways which didn't get you arrested. And I think the threat always of detention, arrest, potential hit squads were things that made one, operate in quite a cautious way, but at the same time you had the sense that you were actively in a struggle, that there was support from other comrades, there was support from the international community as well, from certain communities and countries, and the sense that we were struggling for justice against injustice. The lines were quite clearly drawn, and I think that helped to mobilize people.
This is the last difficult question that I have for you. The UDF being assimilated into the ANC. Now, that the cohorts that made up the UDF sort of disintegrated and dispersed into the polity. Do you think that assimilation into the ANC was mismanaged? Because now we see a situation where we can't, it's almost impossible to conceive of such a coalition between such diverse groups of people coming together again.
Yeah. Well, look, the UDF's constitution and its aims and objectives were clearly set out. So the UDF had succeeded in its broad historical mission, if you like, to have assisted in creating a democratic dispensation in our country. And the reality is that many of the people in the UDF affiliates, like say, I'll use myself an example. I was in NUSAS. Yes, I was, in the mid-80s recruited into the ANC underground. There were others who were not, but after the democratic breakthrough, and the UDF being disbanded, many people did join ANC branches, or they just got on with their lives, or they became supporters, or there were others who never joined the ANC. But so then it became the process of the liberation movement establishing itself in a way that it could operate as a political party as well. Structures, branches, contesting elections, and that obviously changed the nature of the struggle. It became more institutionalized as you were operating within a system. But you would remember that the so-called pillars of the struggle that we used to talk about in the 70s and 80s were the international isolation of apartheid, the armed struggle. We can assess all how effective they were. And then it was the political underground was the third pillar, and the fourth one was the mass pillar, which some of us were involved in both the political underground and the mass struggle. Others were involved directly in MK and the international. So now you're this organization of people from exile, people from internal, and that threw up its own contradictions. So in my own view, it was correct that at that point, the UDF, disbanded. So that you use the word of assimilation. I don't know if that's the correct word, because yes, many of the leaders became leaders formally in the ANC after that.
Some would say, not use the word, some would use the word co-opted.
Yeah, some would use that word. But what I'm saying is that if you look at it, the organizations which constituted the UDF, like say the trade unions, the student movement, the youth movements, so you had South African Youth Congress then, and then that became ANC Youth League. So a vehicle like PSYCO, which was organizing progressive youth, is no more. And we talked earlier about the weaknesses of the Youth League and the need to strengthen it. So it did change the dynamic. But what I'm saying is that I don't think there's front politics as such has outlived its usefulness. I think progressive front politics around campaigns for instance, a living wage, campaigns against corruption, campaigns against eviction of farm workers. I think there's a possibility of building those coalitions or those fronts around particular issues. But it's 40 years of the UDF in 20th of August 2023 this year. Mm-hmm. And I've heard that there is going to be quite a significant remembrance of that day, and also a reflection on some of the issues we've been talking about. What are the lessons learned? How do we work in an inclusive way? How do we build consensus? How do we avoid leadership conflict actually demobilizing the organization and taking us off our goals? So I think it's going to be an interesting time to reflect on that 40 years. I can't believe that it's 40 years ago, but literally that's what it will be this year.